Japan's front looked strong. The support system was breaking. By the summer of 1943, Japanese soldiers in New Guinea could still be terrifyingly difficult to dislodge. They held steep jungle ridges behind machine guns, mortars, trenches, and bunkers cut into ground that already favored the defender. Australian attacks sometimes advanced only a few dozen yards before being stopped. Positions that looked insignificant on a map could consume days of fighting and dozens of casualties. Japanese troops still counterattacked, infiltrated supply tracks, and forced Allied units to fight for terrain that seemed almost designed to resist them. Look only at the front line, and Japan did not appear to be collapsing. But the front line was becoming the wrong place to measure Japanese strength. Behind those bunkers was another battlefield. The system that delivered reinforcements, ammunition, food, replacement aircraft, fuel, and reserves. It connected major bases such as Rabaul to forward positions around La and Salamaua. It depended on ships, barges, submarines, airfields, rough tracks, coastal staging points, and thousands of men simply moving material through some of the most difficult terrain in the Pacific. And by 1943, the Allies were increasingly attacking that system rather than merely attacking the soldiers at its end. That distinction would transform the campaign. A machine gun bunker could remain lethal even while the army supporting it was becoming harder to reinforce. A Japanese battalion could still win a local firefight while its commanders were losing flexibility across the larger theater. A defensive position did not have to be physically destroyed to become strategically less useful. That is what began happening in eastern New Guinea. The Japanese front still looked strong. The system behind it was starting to break. To understand why, it helps to forget the front line for a moment and look at what was required to keep that front alive. Japan's position around La and Salamaua sat at the end of a long and difficult military network. Rabaul, on the northeastern tip of New Britain, was one of the central Japanese bases in the region. Its harbor, airfields, supply facilities, and concentration of troops allowed Japan to support operations across the Bismarck Archipelago, the Solomons, and New Guinea. But having men and supplies at Rabaul was not the same thing as having them at the front. They still had to move. For La, the most efficient method was movement by sea. Large transports could carry quantities of troops, artillery, ammunition, vehicles, food, and equipment that would have been extremely difficult to move through the interior of New Guinea. Destroyers could provide escort and sometimes carry men themselves. Once cargo reached the coast, it still had to be unloaded, dispersed, stored, and pushed toward units operating inland. That last stage was brutally difficult. New Guinea was not a landscape that rewarded large-scale movement. Dense jungle reduced visibility and slowed troops. Mountain ranges cut across operational routes. Heavy rain could turn tracks into mud and rivers into obstacles. Disease weakened units before battle even began. Roads were scarce, and building new ones required enormous labor. This meant Japanese power in eastern New Guinea rested on a chain. Supplies first had to exist somewhere farther back. Then they had to be transported forward. Then they had to survive Allied interception. Then they had to be unloaded. Then they had to be distributed through a hostile environment. And only after all of that could they become useful combat power. Every stage created friction. Every stage created a possible bottleneck. And as Allied air power grew, the sea routes connecting those stages became increasingly dangerous. This did not mean that Japanese troops near La were constantly starving or that their supply system suddenly stopped functioning. That would be too simple. Military systems rarely fail in a single clean moment. They lose efficiency. A ship that once made a large delivery is replaced by several smaller craft. A route that once moved troops quickly becomes too exposed, forcing movement at night. Supplies arrive, but not in the quantities commanders wanted. A reinforcement can still be sent, but only after delay. A unit can still be supported, but supporting it means another unit receives less. The important change is not always that an option disappears. Sometimes the change is that every remaining option becomes worse. That distinction was especially important in New Guinea because Japan was no longer fighting only to seize new ground. The strategic situation in the Pacific had changed. The offensives of 1942 had run into increasingly effective Allied resistance. Guadalcanal had been lost. Japanese attempts to cross the Owen Stanley Range toward Port Moresby had failed. Buna and Guinea had fallen. The Allies were no longer simply trying to stop Japanese advances. They were beginning to build the ability to move forward themselves. That created a different kind of pressure. A Japanese position that had once served as a platform for expansion now had to be defended against an enemy with growing air power, improving amphibious capability, better intelligence, and an expanding logistical base. The same geography that had made Allied operations difficult now also punished Japan. Every additional mile forward increased the distance from major Japanese supply centers. Every aircraft sent south needed fuel, maintenance, spare parts, trained crews, and protected airfields. Every battalion reinforced at La or Salamaua had to be transported there and then fed once it arrived. And because the Allies were developing the ability to strike movement itself, Japan could no longer think only about how many troops it possessed. It had to think about how safely those troops could be moved, how quickly they could be reinforced, how much ammunition could reach them, whether air power could cover the routes, and whether the same transport system could continue working once the Allies identified it. The decisive question was not simply whether Japanese troops were capable of defending La. They were. The deeper question was whether Japan could continue feeding enough combat power into that position faster than the Allies could disrupt, divert, or bypass the system supporting it. In March 1943, Japan attempted to answer that problem in the most direct way possible. A major convoy left Rabaul carrying thousands of troops and large quantities of equipment toward La. If it succeeded, Japanese strength on the New Guinea coast would increase substantially. If it failed, the consequences would extend far beyond the ships themselves. Because the Allies were about to demonstrate that moving a large military force across the Bismarck Sea was no longer merely transportation. It had become a battle. The convoy that left Rabaul at the beginning of March represented exactly what Japan still needed to be able to do. 8 transports, escorted by 8 destroyers, were carrying the remaining elements of the 51st Division toward La. Thousands of men were aboard, along with weapons, ammunition, equipment, and other material required to strengthen Japan's position on the New Guinea coast. This was not simply a movement of ships. It was Japan attempting to convert resources at Rabaul into combat power at La. And the Allies had been preparing specifically to stop that conversion. On February 19th, Allied intelligence intercepted indications that another major reinforcement convoy was being assembled. That warning mattered because attacking ships at sea required far more than having bombers available. The convoy first had to be found. Its movement had to be tracked. Aircraft operating from different bases had to reach the same area at roughly the right time. Fighters had to deal with Japanese air cover, and the aircraft attacking the ships had to use methods capable of hitting maneuvering targets from the air. The Allies had already discovered how difficult that last problem could be. High-altitude bombing could be devastating against fixed targets, but a ship at sea was moving, turning, and firing back. Earlier attempts to stop Japanese reinforcement convoys had often produced disappointing results. So Allied air units practiced. Australian and American crews rehearsed coordinated attacks. B-25 Mitchells were modified for low-level operations. Crews trained in skip bombing, releasing bombs at low altitude so that they bounced across the surface before striking a ship. Other aircraft would attack from different heights and directions, forcing Japanese defenses to respond to several threats at once. This was not a new wonder weapon suddenly appearing over the Bismarck Sea. It was a learning system. Intelligence identified the opportunity. Reconnaissance maintained contact. Engineering altered aircraft. Training changed how they were employed. Different aircraft types were assigned different jobs. And all of those pieces were about to be concentrated against one Japanese logistical movement. The convoy departed Rabaul on March 1st. For a time, weather helped protect it. Tropical storms and heavy cloud complicated Allied reconnaissance. Exactly the kind of conditions Japanese planners hoped might reduce the danger from enemy aircraft. But the convoy was eventually located. On March 2nd, Allied heavy bombers began attacking. One transport was sunk, although the remaining ships continued toward La. That first day did not decide the battle. The decisive attack came the following morning. On March 3rd, a much larger Allied formation approached the convoy. Heavy bombers attacked from above. Fighters engaged Japanese aircraft covering the ships. Australian Beaufighters came in at very low altitude, strafing bridges, exposed gun positions, and crews. Then American B-25s attacked close to the surface using low-level bombing methods for which their crews had been training. The importance of this combination was not that any one aircraft was unbeatable. It was that each attack created problems for the defense while another attack exploited them. A ship turning to complicate one type of attack could expose itself differently to another. Anti-aircraft crews forced to track aircraft overhead also had to deal with attackers approaching almost at sea level. Fighter cover had to protect the convoy while simultaneously fighting Allied escorts. Command crews, defensive guns, maneuver, and air protection were all under pressure at once. Within minutes, the convoy's ability to function as an organized transport formation was collapsing. By the end of the battle, all 8 Japanese transports had been lost. 4 of the 8 escorting destroyers were also sunk. Thousands of men were killed, drowned, wounded, or scattered, and much of the heavy equipment intended for New Guinea never reached the units that needed it. Some survivors were rescued. A portion of the troops eventually reached La, but that did not restore what the convoy had been designed to accomplish. Japan had tried to move a division-sized reinforcement package through the Bismarck Sea. The Allies had demonstrated that such a movement could now be detected, concentrated against, and destroyed before it arrived. And that changed the calculation behind every future large transport mission. This is why the Battle of the Bismarck Sea mattered more than the number of ships lying at the bottom. It changed the cost of moving mass. Before the battle, a large surface convoy remained a plausible way to move thousands of men and substantial quantities of equipment into eastern New Guinea relatively quickly. Afterward, Japanese planners had to confront a much harsher possibility. If Allied aircraft could operate freely over the route, concentrating troops into large transports could also concentrate them into targets. The obvious conclusion would be that Japan had now been cut off from New Guinea. But that is not what happened. Japan adapted, and understanding that adaptation is essential because the weakness of the Japanese system did not come from having no alternatives. It came from the limits of the alternatives that remained. One answer was the submarine. A submarine could approach a threatened coastline with far less exposure than a conventional transport. It could move at night, remain submerged through dangerous areas, and deliver supplies where surface ships might attract Allied aircraft. Japanese submarines therefore became increasingly involved in transport missions. But using a submarine as a cargo ship created a basic trade-off. A vessel designed to carry torpedoes, fuel, machinery, and a combat crew could not suddenly reproduce the capacity of a transport packed with troops and heavy equipment. Even large submarines could carry only a modest load compared with conventional shipping. Some weapons had to be removed to create additional cargo space. Communication with forces ashore could fail. Unloading was difficult. A submarine committed to transport duty was also a submarine unavailable for offensive operations elsewhere. The route survived. Its capacity did not. Japan also expanded its use of barges and other small coastal craft. These solved a different problem. Instead of concentrating large quantities of cargo into a few highly visible ships, supplies could be dispersed among many smaller vessels, often moving close to shore and operating at night. Again, this was a sensible adaptation. A barge was harder to detect than a large transport. Losing one barge was less damaging than losing a ship carrying an entire battalion. Dispersal made the transport network more resilient in one sense, but it also made that network slower and more fragmented. One large ship might carry in a single voyage what required many smaller movements to replace. Barges needed staging points, crews, fuel, maintenance, and repeated trips. Cargo still had to be moved from the shore to units inland. And as Allied aircraft, patrol boats, and coastal forces extended their reach, even these smaller routes came under pressure. Japan also searched for land solutions. The 20th Division was directed toward the construction and use of routes linking the Madong and Wewak region with the Markham Valley and the La area. On a map, this offered an attractive possibility. If the sea had become dangerous, perhaps men and supplies could move overland. But New Guinea turned distance into friction. A route crossing mountains, rivers, rainforest, and undeveloped terrain could not simply replace maritime transport because a commander drew a line across the map. Roads had to be built. Bridges had to be maintained. Supplies consumed manpower simply by being carried forward. Vehicles were useful only where the terrain allowed them to operate. Heavy rain could damage work that had taken weeks to complete. And every additional stage between the rear area and the front consumed time and resources before a single round of ammunition reached a fighting unit. This did not make Japanese adaptation foolish. Quite the opposite. Given the circumstances, commanders were trying to preserve the connection between Rabaul, the northern New Guinea bases, and their forward positions by whatever means remained available. Submarines kept moving cargo. Barges kept running the coast. Troops continued to arrive. Japanese forces at La and Salamaua did not wake up after the Bismarck Sea completely isolated from the rest of the empire. But the character of the network had changed. Large-scale transport had been replaced increasingly by a collection of workarounds. And workarounds imposed costs. A submarine could be safer but carry less. A barge could be harder to spot but move less cargo more slowly. An overland route could avoid Allied aircraft over the sea but demand enormous effort simply to exist. Every adaptation preserved something. None restored the freedom Japan had possessed when large ships could carry large concentrations of men and material forward with acceptable risk. Japan had not lost access to eastern New Guinea. It was losing throughput. And throughput matters because an army does not consume supplies according to how cleverly they were delivered. A soldier still needs food. A gun still needs ammunition. An aircraft still needs fuel and spare parts. A depleted battalion still needs replacements. If those things arrive in smaller quantities or take longer to reach the front, commanders face choices they did not face before. Which position receives the reinforcement? Which sector receives ammunition? Where should the limited transport capacity be concentrated? Which threat is important enough to justify moving scarce combat power toward it? This was the next vulnerability the Allies began to exploit, because once a military system has less flexibility, forcing it to respond in the wrong place becomes far more valuable. And in the mountains and jungle around Salamaua, the Allies were about to create exactly that problem. The next pressure point was not a ship, an airfield, or a supply route. It was a decision. Japan could still move troops into eastern New Guinea, could still reinforce threatened sectors. But as transport capacity became harder to use, every reinforcement represented a choice. And the Allies were about to make that choice increasingly painful. South of La sat Salamaua, surrounded by jungle, mountains, narrow tracks, and a series of ridges that favored defenders who knew how to use them. For the Australians advancing through this country, the fighting could be brutally slow. At Mubwa, Japanese troops occupied positions such as the Pimple, where steep approaches and carefully placed machine guns made direct assault extremely costly. Australian attacks in April and May repeatedly failed to dislodge the defenders. That experience produced an important lesson. If a Japanese position could not be taken at reasonable cost, it might be more effective to threaten its supply routes, infiltrate around it, isolate it, or force the enemy to defend somewhere else. That was not simply a tactical lesson. Applied at larger scale, it became the logic behind the Salamaua campaign. The Allies wanted La. But the most useful way to prepare the attack on La was not necessarily to concentrate everything against La itself. If the Japanese could be forced to commit more of their available combat power farther south, the eventual main objective would become weaker. The pressure around Salamaua therefore had two functions. At the local level, Allied troops were genuinely trying to take ground, disrupt Japanese positions, and improve their own access to the coast. At the operational level, the fighting created a continuing demand for Japanese reinforcements. And there was nothing imaginary about the threat. Australian commandos operating around Bobdubi Ridge raided tracks, established observation positions, ambushed Japanese movements, and threatened the routes connecting Salamaua with the fighting around Mubwa. Japanese commanders responded. They reinforced threatened positions. They launched counterattacks. They brought forward machine guns, mortars, mountain guns, and additional infantry. When Allied pressure increased, Japan did what a defending army would normally be expected to do. It sent more strength toward the danger. This is why describing Salamaua simply as a trick misses the real mechanism. The Japanese were not defending a fictional threat. If they ignored the Allied advance, they risked losing important ground, supply routes, and eventually Salamaua itself. Reinforcing the sector was locally rational. The strategic cost was that those troops could not be in two places at once. This is where limited flexibility becomes dangerous. Imagine that a commander has abundant reserves and reliable transportation. One sector comes under pressure. He reinforces it. A second threat appears. He moves another reserve. If circumstances change, he can shift forces again. The system absorbs the pressure because it has depth. Now remove some of that flexibility. Transportation is slower. Large maritime movement has become dangerous. Supplies arrive through smaller channels. Reinforcements take more effort to move. Suddenly, sending a battalion south is not merely reinforcement. It is a commitment, and the Allies kept creating reasons for Japan to make those commitments. In June, Japanese commanders prepared a major counterattack against Lababia Ridge. 2 battalions of the 66th Regiment were brought forward toward Mubwa with supplies and ammunition. Facing them initially was only an understrength Australian company. When the Japanese attacked on June 21st, The fighting again demonstrated why these positions could not simply be dismissed as a collapsing front. The defenders were heavily pressured. Japanese troops probed the perimeter, attacked from multiple directions, used mortars, and nearly broke through parts of the Australian position. Reinforcements helped stabilize the defense, and after several days the Japanese attack failed. But the larger significance was not simply another Australian defensive victory. Japan had committed men, ammunition, transport effort, and command attention to a battle south of La, and the Allied pressure did not stop. At the end of June, American troops landed at Nassau Bay. The landing itself was chaotic. Heavy surf wrecked or stranded much of the landing craft. Troops struggled ashore in darkness and rain. Japanese forces counterattacked the beachhead, yet the Americans held. Nassau Bay then gave the Allies something more important than another patch of coastline. It shortened the supply route into the Salamaua fighting. The Allies could now support pressure from a direction that had previously been much harder to sustain. Once again, notice the asymmetry. Japan was increasingly improvising ways to preserve an existing support network. The Allies were building new ones. The beachhead did not destroy the Japanese defenders. It made continued Allied pressure easier to maintain. That pressure spread across Mubwa, Babdubi Ridge, Mount Tambu, Roosevelt Ridge, and the approaches to Salamaua. The names themselves are less important than the pattern. At one position, Australians attacked and were stopped. They shifted direction. At another, artillery softened defensive works before infantry attacked from several sides. Elsewhere, commandos cut tracks and ambushed reinforcement parties. American troops advanced from the coast. Japanese units counterattacked and sometimes recovered lost ground. The battle moved slowly because Japanese tactical resistance remained formidable. But while the line moved slowly, Japanese force allocation was moving much faster. Every threatened ridge asked the same question: reinforce it or risk losing it? By July, the Japanese had committed thousands of troops to the Salamaua sector. The concentration became so substantial that Allied commanders increasingly achieved what they had wanted from the operation. Japanese strength was being drawn toward the fighting south of La. This produced one of the campaign's most revealing contradictions. The harder Japanese troops fought around Salamaua, the more successful the Allied diversion could become. A strong defense might preserve a ridge. A reinforcement might prevent a local breakthrough. A counterattack might regain a position. But each of those successes could still consume resources that the larger Japanese system would soon need somewhere else. Local military effectiveness and strategic advantage were no longer the same thing. By late July, this logic was explicit in Allied planning. General Herring informed General Savage that the larger objective was La, and that the role of the forces around Salamaua was to hold Japanese strength in that area. For some commanders on the ground, this clarified something that had previously been obscured by operational security. Salamaua did not have to fall immediately. In fact, taking it too quickly could reduce its value as a magnet. The ideal result was pressure strong enough that Japan believed the sector required reinforcement, but controlled enough that the main Allied blow could be prepared elsewhere. This was a difficult balance. Australian and American troops were still taking real casualties. The battles were not staged performances. The Japanese were not cooperating knowingly with an Allied deception. Yet the strategic effect was real because the threat was real. That is what made the mechanism so powerful. The Allies were exploiting not a Japanese mistake, but a Japanese obligation. Salamaua mattered, so Japan defended it. And because Japan defended it, La became progressively more exposed. By the time Operation Postern approached, a significant share of Japanese combat strength in the area had been pulled into the Salamaua fighting. While La itself depended heavily on base and naval personnel and a much thinner concentration of effective ground troops, the Allies had therefore weakened La without first attacking La. This is a different way to think about maneuver. Movement does not only happen when a division advances across a map. You can also change the battlefield by changing where the enemy feels compelled to place his forces. The Allies had already made it harder for Japan to move large reinforcements into New Guinea. Now they were influencing where the reinforcements that did arrive had to go. Movement had become harder. Allocation had become harder. But one major Japanese capability could still change the equation. Aircraft based farther north could strike Allied shipping, threaten forward bases, and potentially punish any large amphibious or airborne operation against La. If the Allies wanted to attack the position from directions Japan did not expect, they first had to solve the problem of Japanese air power. And that required changing the geography of the war itself. The Japanese army was developing a major air complex around Wewak on the north coast of New Guinea. This created a problem for General George Kenny and the Allied 5th Air Force. Wewak was far enough from the main Allied bases around Port Moresby that simply launching another large bombing campaign was difficult. Heavy bombers could reach the area, but sending them without fighter protection meant accepting greater risk. Fighters operating from farther south lacked the comfortable radius needed to escort strikes and contest Japanese aircraft over the target. The problem was therefore not merely the number of airplanes available. It was geography. An aircraft has combat power only where it can reach. A fighter sitting on an airfield hundreds of miles away may be technically operational, but distance determines how long it can remain over the target, whether it can escort bombers, how much fuel margin its pilot has, and whether it can return safely. So instead of treating geography as fixed, the Allies began changing it. This was one of the most important advantages of the Allied system in New Guinea. Behind the combat aircraft stood engineers, transport crews, construction units, reconnaissance teams, ground personnel, fuel dumps, communications networks, and a growing fleet of transport aircraft. Together, those elements allowed air power to move forward. The runway was becoming a weapon. In the interior of New Guinea, the Allies developed forward airfields at places such as Bena and, more importantly, Silit Sili. Silit Sili was constructed roughly 60 miles southeast of Lae. The location dramatically changed the operational map. Aircraft that had previously been limited by the distance from Port Moresby could now stage, refuel, or operate much farther north. From the new forward base, Allied fighters could reach areas that had previously enjoyed a degree of protection simply because of distance. Wewak was one of them. The Allies understood that keeping the new airfield hidden for as long as possible would multiply its value. Construction proceeded while efforts were made to reduce Japanese awareness of what was happening there. Flights were controlled and the site was camouflaged. Meanwhile, activity around other forward locations helped complicate Japanese reconnaissance and attention. The result was not permanent secrecy. No airfield of meaningful size operating close to an enemy could remain invisible forever. The important point was time. Every day the Japanese failed to fully understand the threat was another day engineers could improve the strip, supplies could accumulate, fuel could be moved forward, and aircraft could prepare to operate from it. That is another way military systems create advantage. Not every advantage is a tank, gun, or aircraft. Sometimes it is simply the ability to make a capability available in the right place before the opponent can respond. By August, Japanese reconnaissance had identified Silit Sili and Japanese aircraft began attacking it. But the discovery came after the strategic geometry had already started changing. The base was now functioning. Allied fighters were operating forward, and the Japanese air concentration at Wewak was becoming vulnerable. This mattered because General Adachi expected the newly organized 4th Air Army in the Wewak area to help protect the flanks of Lae. If the Allies attempted an airborne operation inland, Japanese aircraft could attack the transports. If an amphibious force appeared along the coast, they could attack the shipping. If ground forces moved rapidly through exposed approaches, air attacks could slow them. The 4th Air Army did not need to destroy the Allied invasion force completely. It only needed to impose enough disruption to give Japanese ground forces time to react. Time was exactly what the Allies did not want Japan to have. And Allied intelligence soon revealed an opportunity. Japanese aircraft were concentrating around the Wewak airfields. Concentration created combat power, but concentration also created vulnerability. The same logic that had applied to the convoy in the Bismarck Sea now appeared in another form. Putting many aircraft near the front made them easier to employ. It also put many valuable targets within reach of the same attack. Kenny decided to strike. During the night of August 16th into August 17th, Allied heavy bombers attacked the Wewak airfield complex. The purpose of the night attack was not simply destruction. It also disrupted the airfields, damaged aircraft, disturbed crews, and complicated the ability of Japanese aviation to respond coherently when the next phase arrived. That next phase came at low altitude. On the morning of August 17th, B-25 Mitchell swept toward Wewak, Borum, Dagwa, and the surrounding airfields. Some of these aircraft had been modified for low-level attack. They strafed parked aircraft and dropped fragmentation bombs designed to spread lethal fragments across exposed equipment and personnel. The Japanese had a serious structural vulnerability. Many aircraft were concentrated on forward airfields without enough hardened protection. Early warning was also inadequate. Japanese commanders wanted aircraft close enough to the front to respond rapidly to Allied operations. But the limited depth of the airfield system meant that concentrating them forward also exposed them to surprise attack. Once again, a locally sensible decision created a larger risk. Aircraft closer to the battlefield could reach the battlefield faster, but aircraft closer to Allied air power could also be attacked faster. The August 17th strike caught large numbers on or near the ground. The results were severe. Contemporary and post-war figures differ over the exact number destroyed, damaged, or temporarily put out of action, which is why precise wartime claims should be treated cautiously. But the operational effect is much clearer. U.S. Army histories later summarized the first major strikes as costing the 4th Air Army roughly 3/4 of its aircraft, while Japanese operational strength was reduced to only a fraction of what it had been before the raids. But this was not the annihilation of Japanese air power in New Guinea. Aircraft remained. Units were rebuilt. Japanese pilots would continue flying combat missions. And within weeks, Japanese aircraft would still attack Allied shipping around Lae. The word that matters is not destroyed. It is crippled, because the strategic value of the Wewak attack came from timing. The Allies did not need Japanese aviation to disappear forever. They needed it to be much weaker during a very specific window. The assault on Lae was approaching, and the force Japan expected to interfere with that assault had just suffered a devastating disruption. This exposes another difference between tactical destruction and system effects. Destroying an aircraft removes one machine. Damaging an airfield slows operations. Killing or exhausting trained crews reduces sortie generation. Disrupting maintenance makes surviving aircraft less useful. Damaging communications slows warning and coordination. Forcing remaining aircraft to disperse makes concentration harder. The effect of an air raid, therefore, cannot be measured only by counting wrecks. The real question is what the enemy can still do afterward. Before the Wewak attacks, Japan possessed a substantial forward air concentration that could threaten the developing Allied operation against Lae. Afterward, that force had far less capacity to do so. The Allies had now attacked reinforcement, logistical flexibility, force allocation, distance, and air protection. But none of those advantages mattered unless they could be converted into position. That was the purpose of Operation Postern. The Allied plan for Lae was built around a simple idea with difficult consequences. Do not attack the Japanese position from only one direction. Force it to answer two major threats almost at the same time. The first would come from the sea. The second would appear behind Lae from the air. On September 4, 1943, the Australian 9th Division began landing east of Lae. The amphibious force had sailed through waters that only months earlier would have been much more dangerous. Japanese aircraft still posed a threat. They were not absent, and the Wewak raids had not erased Japanese air power. That distinction became clear almost immediately. Japanese aircraft attacked Allied landing craft and later struck shipping farther down the coast, causing casualties and damaging vessels. But the air response was not strong enough to prevent the landing. That was the operational difference that mattered. The Allies did not require perfect air supremacy. They required enough control of the air and sea to deliver a major force onto the coast, unload it, protect the beachhead, and keep the operation moving. By the end of the landing phase, thousands of Australian troops and large quantities of equipment had been put ashore. Engineers immediately began turning the beachhead into another functioning node in the Allied system. Roads had to be cleared. Supplies had to be organized. Vehicles had to move inland. Bridges had to be built or repaired. The infantry could advance only as fast as the larger system allowed it to remain supplied. This was exactly the kind of capacity that had been growing on the Allied side throughout the campaign. The landing itself was only the beginning. From the beachhead, the 9th Division began advancing west toward Lae. For the Japanese defenders, this created a conventional problem. Enemy troops were approaching from the east. Reinforcements could be shifted. Defensive positions could be established. Bridges and river crossings could be contested. If this had been the only Allied move, the Japanese still had a recognizable front to defend. But on the following day, the geometry changed. On September 5th, 96 C-47 transport aircraft carried the American 503rd Parachute Regiment across the Owen Stanley Range toward Nadzab, west of Lae. The airborne force was part of a much larger aerial operation involving fighters, bombers, weather aircraft, smoke-laying aircraft, and escorting formations. This was not simply a dramatic parachute drop. It was the product of the system the Allies had spent months building. Transport aircraft made the movement possible. Fighter coverage made it safer. Forward airfields extended operational reach. Reconnaissance identified the objective. Engineers would make the captured airfield usable. And once Nadzab was secured, the airborne troops would not remain isolated. They would open the door for something much larger. The drop began shortly after 10 in the morning. Within minutes, the 503rd was on the ground. Japanese resistance around the landing area was negligible. Nadzab was secured, but capturing a lightly defended airfield was not the real achievement. The important question was what the Allies could do with it. Engineers and pioneer troops immediately began improving the field. Transport aircraft soon started carrying elements of the Australian 7th Division into Nadzab. The Allies had effectively created a second major approach to Lae. One force was advancing from the east along the coast. Another was building combat power to the west. This was the moment when the previous stages of the campaign began to combine. The destruction of the Bismarck Sea convoy had made mass reinforcement by sea far more dangerous for Japan. Japanese substitutes had preserved supply access, but at lower capacity and greater friction. The fighting around Salamaua had absorbed thousands of Japanese troops south of the real Allied objective. Forward Allied airfields had changed the range equation. The Wewak raids had badly weakened the Japanese air concentration that might otherwise have struck the transports gathering around Nadzab or concentrated more heavily against the amphibious force. Now those advantages were being converted into position. This is the difference between possessing capability and using it strategically. Aircraft alone did not take Lae. Shipping alone did not take Lae. Logistics alone did not take Lae. The decisive effect came from combining those capabilities so that Japan had to solve several problems faster than its increasingly constrained system could respond. The Japanese command now faced a shrinking set of choices. To the east, the 9th Division was pushing toward Lae. To the west, the 7th Division was beginning to build strength around Nadzab. South of Lae, the Salamaua front had already absorbed substantial combat power. Japanese air support had been badly disrupted. Sea reinforcement was dangerous, and moving large formations through the interior of New Guinea was slow even under good conditions. The Japanese defenders could still fight. That had not changed. What had changed was their ability to decide where the next important fight would happen. This was the real achievement of Postern. The Allies had changed the terms of the contest. Earlier in the campaign, Allied troops often had to move toward prepared Japanese positions through jungle and along narrow approaches. The defender could use terrain, bunkers, machine guns, and short local counterattacks to impose heavy costs. Now Japan was being forced to respond to Allied movements generated by an expanding transportation system. A division could arrive from the sea. Another could arrive through an airfield captured inland. Air power could shift forward as runways were built. Supplies could follow through increasingly developed Allied bases. The battlefield was no longer defined only by the ridge directly in front of a Japanese battalion. It was being defined by the network behind both armies. That did not make the Allied advance effortless. The Australian 9th Division encountered swollen rivers, destroyed bridges, difficult tracks, Japanese resistance, and the constant friction of moving a large formation through wet tropical terrain. The 7th Division faced its own logistical challenge as units flew into Nadzab and moved toward the Markham Valley. The race toward Lae was not a clean pincer closing on a helpless enemy. Japanese forces still had routes of withdrawal, and Japanese commanders understood the danger before the Allied arms could physically meet. This created the critical decision of the operation. Continue defending Lae and risk having the escape routes narrowed further, or abandon the position while enough freedom remained to preserve the surviving troops. For months, Japanese commanders had reinforced positions in response to Allied pressure. At Lae, the logic reversed. More commitment could now produce less strategic value. Holding the town would not reopen the Bismarck Sea. It would not restore the aircraft lost or damaged around Wewak. It would not pull the troops already committed around Salamaua instantly back into position. And it would not remove the Australian forces advancing from east and west. The physical defenses at Lae had not suddenly become useless. The position had become less useful. That difference is crucial. A military position has value only in relation to the larger system. Can it be supplied? Can it be reinforced? Can forces move in and out? Does holding it protect something important? Does it preserve future options? Or does it simply consume troops that will soon be needed somewhere else? By September, Lae was moving toward the wrong side of that equation. The Japanese therefore began withdrawing. The decision meant surrendering an important base, but it also offered the possibility of preserving men for the next defensive line. On September 11th, Salamaua fell after the Japanese evacuated the position that had absorbed so much Allied and Japanese effort. 5 days later, on September 16th, Australian troops entered Lae. The Allied arms had converged, but there was no destroyed Japanese army waiting inside the town. Much of the surviving Japanese force had already begun the brutal movement away from Lae toward the Horn Peninsula. And that withdrawal reveals exactly what had and had not been broken. Lae had fallen, but the Japanese army had not been destroyed. That distinction matters because it tells us what the Allies had actually achieved. Thousands of Japanese troops escaped toward the northern coast of the Horn Peninsula. They crossed mountains, rivers, jungle, and tracks that turned the retreat itself into another logistical ordeal. Many survived. Those troops would fight again. The campaign in New Guinea was far from finished. So September 1943 was not the moment when Japanese resistance in New Guinea ended. Nor was it the moment when every Japanese supply route disappeared. Barges would continue moving. Submarines would continue carrying cargo. Japanese aircraft would return to the fight. Strong defensive positions would again impose serious costs on Allied troops. If we define a military system as broken only when every one of its components stops functioning, then Japan's system had not broken at all. But military systems do not need to disappear before they lose the ability to produce the strategic result they were built to produce. That is what changed around Lae. At the beginning of 1943, Japan could still imagine reinforcing eastern New Guinea with large surface movements from Rabaul. Bismarck Sea made that increasingly dangerous. Japan adapted with submarines, barges, coastal routes, and attempts to improve overland connections. Those adaptations kept the front alive. But they did not fully replace the speed, capacity, and flexibility that had been lost. Allied pressure around Salamaua then forced Japan to spend scarce combat power defending a genuine threat south of Lae. Again, the Japanese response was not irrational. The problem was that every battalion committed there was a battalion that could not simultaneously strengthen Lae. Then the geography of the air war changed. Allied engineers and transport units pushed airfields forward. Tsili extended Allied reach. Wewak became vulnerable. The August raids did not erase Japanese aviation from New Guinea. They badly weakened it just before the Allies needed freedom to execute their next operation. And then Postern converted those changes into maneuver. Australian troops came ashore east of Lae. American paratroopers seized Nadzab to the west. The Australian 7th Division followed through the new airborne gateway. Suddenly, Japanese commanders were no longer solving the old problem of how to stop another attack against a fortified ridge. They were trying to answer major Allied forces appearing on opposite sides of Lae while the systems for reinforcing, supplying, and protecting that position were under growing pressure. That is what had broken. Not Japanese courage. Not every bunker. Not every supply route. Not even the Japanese army itself. What was breaking was the connection between tactical strength and strategic usefulness. A Japanese battalion could still defend a ridge. But if the Allies could bypass that ridge, pressure its supply route, draw reserves somewhere else, reduce the aircraft protecting it, and place another force behind it, then the battalion's ability to fight no longer guaranteed that the position it defended could be held. This is why the New Guinea campaign cannot be explained simply by saying that the Allies had more aircraft, more supplies, or more men. Those advantages mattered. But resources become decisive only when a military system can convert them into options. The Allies increasingly could. They could detect a convoy and mass different aircraft against it. They could replace a long jungle supply route with a coastal beachhead. They could build an airfield and change the range of the air war. They could sustain pressure at Salamaua while preparing a different operation at Lae. They could move one division by sea and another through the air. Each new capability gave Allied commanders more choices. For Japan, the direction was increasingly reversed. A major convoy became too dangerous, so smaller transport methods had to replace it. Salamaua came under pressure, so scarce combat strength moved south. Allied airfields moved forward, so bases once protected by distance became exposed. Wewak was struck, so fewer aircraft were available to challenge the coming operation. Lae was threatened from east and west, and eventually withdrawal became the rational option. That is the deeper meaning behind the fall of the Japanese front in eastern New Guinea. The Allies did not simply hit the strongest point until it collapsed. They progressively changed the system around it until holding that point became less valuable than leaving it. And that is one of the most important differences between winning a battle and changing a war. A position can look formidable on the map. Its soldiers can still fight effectively. Its defenses can still kill anyone who approaches them. But combat power matters strategically only if the larger military system can move it, reinforce it, supply it, protect it, and concentrate it where the next threat appears. In New Guinea in 1943, the Allies became increasingly better at doing exactly that. Japan became increasingly worse at it. The front still looked strong, but the system behind it was breaking.